Having you a fool. They know I'm the topic.
Yeah, 2500.
They heard I'm the topic. I keep them talking, my ears are open. I can hear what they saying. I'm feeling like Martin. I keep it stepping. I'm kicking knowledge like I'm putting out pans. Just X around and you can tell how I'm rocking. You'll get the message. I ain't sending out spam. The streets is talking and they know that I'm popping. I'm feeling like I got the word in my hand. They heard I'm the topic. I keep them talking, my ears are open. I can hear what they saying. I'm feeling like Martin. I keep it stepping. I'm kicking knowledge like I'm putting out pans. Just X
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of Truth and Heart. I love this mug. This is my Wonder Woman mug. My daughter got this last year for me for my birthday. She knows that I was a huge Wonder Woman fan growing up. And my daughter thinks I'm kind of a little bit her Wonder Woman. So, excuse me. I have to have my coffee. Hopefully, you guys are doing as best as you can be in light of these unprecedented times that we still find ourselves in as we all try to adjust to social distancing and make the best out of these adjustments as we can. I know that for many of us, folk of faith, be it Christian faith or Jewish faith, we just celebrated Passover and also Easter. And so, we've got to be mindful and sensitive to, I think, still socially distanced, but also engage in and commemorate, excuse me, those moments and those times that are still pretty important to us. A lot of folk right now, young people in particular, they're going to miss out on high school graduations, on college graduations. Even my daughter is bummed about missing out on her 8th grade graduation. We have folks who were hoping to have big weddings, baby showers. I've been seeing on the news, people as best as they can have been showing up for their loved ones who've been having weddings by just having drive-by. The attendees are in their cars and appropriately socially distancing, but still showing up for the couple who's getting married. So here's to continued vigilance, safety, and also creativity while we try to find ways to show up for each other and to celebrate these important milestones and moments in our lives. Okay, so let's get started. Doc's got something to say. Now, this past weekend on Lifetime was the premiere of the Clark Sisters movie. And for those of you who are not familiar with the Clark Sisters, many refer to them as the first ladies of gospel music. I mean, I love their gospel music. They really came to the fore in the 70s, excuse me, and in the 80s. And the former group of 5 is now a group of 3. They 5 sisters, and it talks about this. Really, the movie, I think, is a story of relationships, faith, and also the struggle for independence, creativity, and flexibility, and freedom within that. So we see the Clark sisters really flourish and thrive and bloom and reach excellence under the firm and steady hand of their mother, the late Dr. Maddie Moss Clark, who was this amazing musician and this talent. And so the sisters were brought up in religious Christian faith, but the particular denomination, Church of God in Christ. I grew up and was reared with very Pentecostal apostolic holiness, which is maybe like I would say a few steps away from Church of God in Christ. My mom has told me that my grandmother, when they were growing up, would not allow them to go to the movie theaters. And I was like, why wouldn't she? What was that about? Because she said, the Bible said, do not sit behind the seat of the scornful. I know that scripture and I know that text. That's in the Old Testament, but the interpretation of the text, right? And so I think that for the most part, many parents do the best that they can do with what they are taught, with what they understand to do it with. But in this movie, we see these dynamics between a mother who is a very strong leader, a strong presence in her daughter's lives, who pushes her daughter for excellence. She pushes her daughters to strive toward excellence and perfection in their gift, in their talent, in their craft. And she pushes herself. But we also see that dynamic kind of juxtaposed, framed, if you will, within these overbearing, I'm going to say it for what it is, overbearing, rigid, stifling opinions and perspectives from the men in their lives related to how women in the faith should conduct themselves and should, you know, carry themselves within the ministry. And so the story really kind of shows how, for many of us, our walk, our journey in faith, our process as it relates to um, tapping into our gifts and wanting to manifest those, it's not always formulaic. And I think that we see as the daughters each come into their own, we see their mothers struggle with that too, in terms of where is their freedom, right? And so let's talk about this as it relates to our religious beliefs, right? What we understand, what we're taught, what we believe about what the Bible suggests for those of us, or for people of faith about what, in general, what our religious texts tell us, what we interpret, they tell us to mean about freedom and about how we should live our lives, versus trying to counter and break free from some of these stifling, these oppressive views. At one point in the movie, and this is where my heart really went out to Dr. Manny Moss Clark. She's called before the church board because she was also the international minister of music within the church for the Church of God in Christ, right? And so the girls, and she was so excited. They had just come off of their Grammy performance in the mid 80s. So here she is, she's called before the board, and she's told that if she really wants to, they had removed her initially from that position, but she's told that if she wants to retain her position, she can no longer perform on stage with her daughters. That, my heart sank. It literally sank to the bottom of my stomach at that point in the movie, because she even says to them, the elders, the board members, who were all men, you're trying to separate me from my daughters. This is my gift. And so, what does that look like, folks, when we still want to hold on to and still carry our faith with us and as a guiding factor in our lives? But does that, what that looks like from person to person, does that always have to look the same? And I can hear some of y'all religious folk now. I'm not talking about, in terms of just being, so to speak, sloppy or loose with how you live your life, and not having integrity and losing your sense of morality. But does that mean that that has to look the same for everybody all of the time? And I think you see the dynamic between the Clark sisters evolve and change because each one of the sisters really struggles, some more than others, to come into their own as it relates to their own individuality, wanting to feel like there's freedom within that for for them to figure out this is what I like, this is what I don't like. Can I have something separate from the rest of you guys? And so, especially for folks who I think grew up, so to speak, in the church, where church attendance, church activity, church membership, the Clark sisters were preachers' children, PKs, preachers' kids. Their father was a pastor, their mother was a former first lady. What that looks like for them. Um, I think we got to be careful with that as parents because we can have our own ideas and opinions that are often even biblically formed or informed by our religious beliefs in terms of how we think our children should live their lives and the decisions that they make when they get older. But that's such a struggle when our children, once they enter adulthood, want to do something different. Sometimes maybe even totally rebel completely against what we've taught them or want to figure it out for themselves. And I think potentially that's where the rebellion can come in because we see one of the sisters in the movie, Denise. She at least the way the movie portrayed it, she rebelled the most as it relates to having many children, several before she was married. I think Denise struggled to really kind of find her own identity outside of and figure out her own belief system outside of who she was taught to be or how she was taught that should look like. And so this movie, folks, I could say so many different things about it. But for now, as it relates to the interaction, the dynamic between church, our faith, and wanting to be creative and wanting to manifest or embody what we think our gifts, our God given gifts and talents are, even as it relates to Christian music or a faith based lifestyle. We got to be careful, folks, that we don't, as our children get older and as they grow, they are their own individuals. They have their own set of beliefs, ideas, opinions, and they're going to want to do things the way they want to, how they see fit, which may clash in some instances for what you think. But does that mean that within that, or even what you have taught them based on what your religious text, your interpretation of what the religious text suggests? How much do we give our children, our adult children, our children who are young adults in particular? Because I think, yes, children are their own individuals even when they're like this. But at that point, up until they get to be a certain age, we're still, how we parent and teach them, I think, is a little differently because, they're babies, they're five, yes, they still have a voice, but we're still instructing them in terms of right, wrong, safety, what's not safe, things like that. But what does that look like as our children get older? as they enter into their young adult years, as they become adults, as they have their own ideas, opinions, beliefs that are not, that sometimes are just the opposite of what we've taught them and of how we've taught them. I think this movie, among other things, really kind of highlights that, what that independence, what that freedom can look like, or the struggle for that freedom when there's this interpretation, this view of how you should live, of how you should think, of how you should be. Chime in below, folks. I could touch on so many different other things about this movie, but for now, let's just keep it at that. Let's start with that, if you will. Chime into the discussions below. Let me know what you think. This movie, like I said, has struck me. It struck me differently because I've never seen a movie on film, at least from what I've seen. I've never seen a movie on film really attempt to tackle those dynamics and a lot of those subtleties that are present there, still present there for a lot of us as it relates to, those of us who were reared to be pretty churched, so to speak. Preacher's kids, or those of us who were reared, under a pretty firm religious faith-based hand, and what that looks like as you get older to try and figure that out for yourself. Not so much what your parents taught you, but as you enter into adulthood, what that looks like for yourself. As I said before, I'm a seminarian. I'm a seminary graduate. I graduated from Fuller Theological Seminary in Pasadena. Um, I attended an integrative program there, integrating psychology and theology. So I earned my PhD there while I was also simultaneously pursuing my master in divinity. So I was also working on seeking ordination as a minister as well. So I understand. This movie piqued my interest in that way as well, right? For us, the struggle, so to speak, to figure out what that faith looks like for you personally, what you think. All right. So, okay, folks, chime into the discussions below. Leave your feedback. We got to move on. So, let's move on to our next segment, mental health matters. As we're all trying to figure out this new normal, so to speak, what this looks like for us, as we are in the land of, excuse me, social distancing, and more still, we're not as mobile, many of us, or if we are mobile, we're not stretching out as far. And so some of us, as a result, find ourselves in closer contact and proximity, maybe, to relatives and or loved ones where there's tension, where there has been a history of conflict, of family problems that haven't been addressed, that have just lingered. And so now, because some of you, especially due to the economic hardships from a lot of job closures and things like that, you may find yourselves before where you could kind of stay busier and create a little more distance between some of these issues with some of your loved ones and or family members. Now maybe it's not as easy to distance yourself from them. Some of you may have had to move back in with loved ones where there's tension or conflict. Some of you, if you were in the same household, living with them before you were working nonstop, and so you weren't in the house as much with them. But now, for those of you who are fortunate enough to be able to telework and work from home, maybe you find yourself in closer proximity to them. So let's talk about this. From a mental health perspective, how are you going to deal with these conflicts? I think that for some people, maybe the thought has entered their mind at this time to kind of snatch the rug or the cover off of everything and try and finally just speak to things once and for all for what they may appear to be or for what you've experienced, right? So if in the past it's been difficult to kind of talk to your mother or your uncle or your loved one about some of the things that have happened in the family, in the interactions, in the relationships that have caused you to feel hurt or pain, or even some things that were abusive in the past, maybe folks weren't ready to receive that, or it was maybe a little easier to kind of just brush past that because of the busyness of life, if you will. And so some of you may be struggling or may be experiencing difficulties as it relates to how do you approach this with them, right? We have a lot of time on our hands now because we're all still. Let's talk about that conflict. I will say this: be careful. I'm always one, and I'm always advocating for others to speak their truth, to stand in their truth, for whatever that may mean for themselves, right? So I get that. But truth is only as good as what you do with it. So, in other words, a lot of people will sometimes say they want to know the truth or they're ready for the truth. Just because you may be ready and in a place to hear or to process certain things doesn't necessarily mean that other people are. And I got to tell you, folks, in my line of work and who I do it with, the majority of my work has centered on, for the past 20 plus years, working with primarily folk who've experienced a lot of trauma: children, adolescents, adults, families, men, women, um, folks who've gone through quite a bit. I've worked with survivors of various forms of abuse, but I also work with perpetrators of various forms of abuse. And the two aren't always synonymous. Not every perpetrator was at one point a victim of abuse, not necessarily. And so I get it from both sides in terms of the perspectives. And so I think that for some people, one of the most heartbreaking things can be when you want to talk about some things that have happened to you or that you've experienced. And the other person not only isn't ready to hear it, but they shut down. They call you a liar. They get angry at you. They dismiss, they minimize your experiences. They dismiss, minimize your pain, your hurt, your rejection, your fear. That's tough. So, as we're sitting here, right, many of us are more still now than ever. And if there's this conflict that's going on between you and your loved ones, and you believe that if you can address the conflict, maybe things might get better, be careful. Be careful. Are you communicating? What's the goal of the communication? Are you communicating because you want your truth to be heard? You want your experiences to be known? Or are you communicating because you're looking for a certain response, feedback, or validation from whoever you're telling it to? Because those two things, those are two separate things as it relates to communication in this particular instance. Sometimes, folk, it just is what it is. Some people aren't capable of, aren't interested in, don't want to hear it, can't hear it. Sometimes our loved ones, they have their own wounds, they have their own struggles, their own blocks, their own things that they're dealing with that they can't even hear what you're saying because of what's heavy in their hearts, what's heavy in their minds, what's heavy in their spirits. And so I just want you to be careful with that. Be clear as best as you can be about the truth that you want to get to, maybe in some of these conflictual relationships and interactions. Not everyone is going to be ready or able or open to hear it, receive it, or to respond to it. So, what does that mean for you then, if you're even more so in closer proximity to these folks? So, now what? Is there anybody else that you could confide in? Maybe sometimes the people that you're looking for support from, unfortunately, just may not be able to give it to you. That's a painful reality, but sometimes that is what it is. I learned a long time ago that before our parents, for example, were our parents, they were men and women with their own individual experiences, attitudes, beliefs. We hope that once they became a parent, that our needs will be at the forefront for them. But sometimes that's easier said than done. Like I said, a lot of our parents, and for example, have their own wounds that they're carrying. Maybe there's someone else that you can confide in. Or maybe that means you might have to adjust your expectations from those loved ones. It sucks, I know, but people can't nurture you and receive you beyond where they are. Folks, people, folks just can't do it. Some people are just struggling to do that for themselves. And it's painful, but they may not be able to do it in the way that you need them to do it as their child. So maybe you might have to adjust some of your expectations. Not easy answers, not easy fixes. But again, just be clear about the concept of truth and what you are hoping to happen as a result of speaking your truth. Okay, folks, we got to wrap it up for the day. Chime into the discussions below. I will love to hear your feedback and we'll respond. Okay, folks, that's it for this week's episode of Truth and Heart with Doc. Let your mind be clear to recognize the truth and your heart open to receive it. Take care. Bye bye.